Great, thanks, Nick. Welcome, everyone. Thank you again for taking the time to join me today. This is part one of our three-part series covering updates to ISO 27001. Super exciting time. I know that this is an extremely hot topic in the ISO world right now. For those of you who are not aware, we actually have not seen updates to the standard in almost a decade. So today I plan to address the recent changes to ISO and what that means for your organization. A little bit about myself for those of you who don't know me. I'm a manager here at Risk 360, primarily focused on assisting clients with creation, implementation, and maintenance of their ISO 27001 programs. I've been in the industry for about 8 years now and work with a variety of clients from small startups, information technology orgs, software companies, to large, complex, and publicly traded organizations. So if you're on the call today and one of my clients, welcome. If you're new to ISO or haven't worked with me in the past, then I'm glad to have you here and looking forward to getting to know you a bit more. As far as the agenda, I just want to kind of go over this in more detail so that we're all clear on what to expect from today's webinar. Most of you are here to understand the changes to ISO and what the implication of those changes are to your business. So that's what we plan to cover here today. In addition, I will provide you with some of the tools that can help guide you throughout your journey transitioning to the new standard. I will note that this webinar is just part one, as I mentioned, of the three-part series, and intended to cover more of the logistical aspects of the changes. So things like timelines to the transition, what are the net new controls, new terminology and layout, whereas later episodes within this series will cover more specifics around the implementation methodologies and recommendations for meeting the objectives so that you all can be successful in your external audits. So with that, let me just step through this here. What is ISO 27001? I'll touch on this briefly for any of you who are new to ISO, but know we do have a lot of content on this topic already. So if you're new to ISO and want to understand a little bit more about what ISO is, hit me up after this webinar and I can give you some content there to help answer some of those questions. What has changed? Here I will cover the net new controls that have been added, in addition to how the standard has been restructured and new terminology to look out for. What are the implications to my business? This will be the section where I cover mostly the timelines, some of the key dates to be met so that you can start to think about what that means for your business. And then where do I go to find guidance on the topic? This is really where I hope to equip you with some of the tools and guidance to success as you begin your journey. All right, so let's get into it. What is ISO? I think before we begin dissecting the changes to the updated framework, I just want to kind of take a step back and talk through what is ISO. Like I said, we do have some more content around this, so if you're new to ISO, reach out to me after the webinar and I'll get you that material. But in short, ISO is an international standard. It's an annual audit of a detailed scope and results in an ISO 27001 certification. So ultimately, the international standard, it helps facilitate international trade. It's helpful to know that the standard was developed and published by the International Organization, or ISO. It's a non-governmental international organization, so it's kind of like a standard language regardless of where your business is working out of. Some of the standards that you may be familiar with are quality management. That's a super popular one. That's ISO 9001. There's also standards around food safety, environmental management, just to name a few. But most important, just know that it is recognized internationally. It's an annual audit of a defined scope. That really is just the opportunity for organizations to define their information security management system. You'll hear me talk about this a lot throughout the webinar, your ISMS, and that's really your approach to managing sensitive information. Your scope will typically include people, processes, or IT systems that are involved in successful delivery of your product or service. So a lot of what you'll want to think about here is top management. Are you getting executive buy-in? What are the internal and external drivers to obtaining certification? So that's kind of what you'll see from the annual audit of a defined scope. And then results in an ISO 27001 cert. This is why most of you all are here, right? Like there's no question about the value of an ISO certification. In any B2B business, most of your customers will require certification. So it's really just table stakes here, and it's non-negotiable for many of you here today. So again, like with all of that, it's not just a piece of paper. It's not just, to show that you're certified. It really also provides that assurance that you're meeting a standard set of controls globally. So I just broke this out here in the slide to show you the dates for the changes. Clause 4 through 10, I'll probably refer to that as ISO 27001 throughout the webinar today. That was introduced, changes to that version were introduced in October of 2022. And then Annex A, or what I'll probably refer to as 27002, was introduced in March of last year. So a lot of questions that I've received from clients recently, it's been over a decade. Why are we just now seeing updates to the standard? And I think there are really many reasons for the delay, but they're not entirely clear. I know that it was slated to be updated in 2018. A lot of these ISO certifications are typically reviewed every 5 years, but for whatever reason, 27001, was delayed. That could be because maybe the global pandemic. It's also an extremely extensive review process and requires input from people globally. So that could be another reason there. Another thought is that, maybe there was not significant changes in the field of information management since the last update that would really justify changes. So there are many reasons that really aren't too clear, but just know that we do expect to see changes to this more frequently, at a minimum of every 5 years. So it'll be important for organizations to account for your evolving threat landscape, and have the tools in place to enable you to be agile and quick to conform to these changes as they occur. All right, so let's get into 27001. Here I have essentially just the cover page or the title page from the 2013 to the 2022 version. And what you'll notice actually is that in the 2022 version, the main change in the title page that we see here is that privacy is now included as part of that. I think the reason for this is fairly simple. Privacy protection has become an increasingly important concern in recent years. We know one example of that recently is, I'm sure that you've heard of the GDPR violation by Meta in the news. So I think this will just provide organizations with more guidance on how to implement or have conversations around protection of personal data. I will say that it's important to note that the new version includes privacy considerations, but it's not a standard specifically focused on privacy. So if you're thinking, well, okay, maybe I don't need to pursue another certification to cover privacy, or if you process personal information, you'll still want to pursue compliance with other standards. Maybe 27018 is a good one that provides guidance on protecting personal data in the cloud. There's also 27701, which is just an extension of 27001 that provides additional guidance on how to implement and maintain a privacy information management system. But some interesting thoughts there I just want to bring to your attention. There's not like net new controls that result from the addition of privacy being included in the title page, but something to consider there. and it'll be interesting to see how organizations, run with that, and maybe include a lot of these conversations as part of their risk assessment activities, considering how they're complying with GDPR, California Privacy Act, but again, no net new controls for privacy. So I want to further break down, we looked at the cover page. I want to look at the table of contents for 27001. On the left, I have the 2013 table of contents, and on the right, I have the new 2022 table of contents. At a glance, I know that these screenshots are kind of hard to see, but at a glance, you're probably thinking, okay, well, I don't see much that has changed. And that's correct. Really, 27001, there are not many notable changes to 27001. One thing you may notice is in clause 6 here around planning, that is one thing that I would note that has been slightly updated. Really, it was just reorganized to remove any potential ambiguity. So if you're familiar with ISO, and clause 6 calls for planning your risk assessment activities. So if you want to really get into the details, in 2013, I believe it was 6.1.3, notes that Annex A is a comprehensive list of control objectives, whereas in 2022, clause 6 notes that Annex A is a list of possible information security controls. So just some minor wording and minor wording change there to note that, again, it's just possible list of information security controls. It's not fully comprehensive. So I think the takeaway there is that you can still choose, you can still get certified against ISO 27001 and choose to implement a completely customized control set that's not necessarily Annex A. I will say, in my experience, I've not seen many organizations go that route to date, but it is something to consider, to use more of a robust control set, or maybe if you're looking to expand your certifications to include high trust or PCI or attestations like SOC 2. Just know that the way that this new certification is set out is intended to make it a more ingestible standard. And I'll get into that a little bit more as we walk through this. Also, you can see in the arrow pointing down, Annex A is in the normative document that we'll discuss, and it's in both 2013 and 2022 versions. So if you've followed us in the past, you've probably seen this slide before, or if you are already ISO certified against 27001, you're probably familiar with this slide as well. I wanted to bring this up because I've just talked to you about the title page. I've mentioned that a lot of things have not changed within ISO 27001, but that's not to say that you're not going to need to still have conversations around the changes with your IRC. Basically, you need to continue to maintain your ISMS. So know that before the transition, there will need to be work done with your management framework to drive decisions that will need to be made as part of the updates. So like I mentioned, if you're meeting quarterly with the IRC, make sure to include within those agendas conversations around these updates. Otherwise, there'll likely be problems to transition if no one is in the know of these updates and you're not being proactive around the conversations to the updates. So just because the control objectives haven't specifically changed within 27001 doesn't mean that you shouldn't continue to maintain the effectiveness of your ISMS. That's just as important as understanding the net new controls that I'll discuss in 27002. All right, so this is the fun part. Let's kind of get into what the changes are and where most of your time will be spent during the transition. So compared with the old version, the old edition, the number of controls in 27002 have decreased from 114 controls and 14 clauses to 93 controls and 4 clauses, also known as themes. And I'll get into that. But for the controls in the 2022 version, 11 of the controls are new. I'll go through the notable net new controls, but again, the specific implementation guidance will be provided in later webinars as part of this series. 24 of the 93 controls were merged from existing controls, and then 58 controls were updated. Those updates may have just been a name change or additional implementation guidance to be more specific. But based on those changes, it is important to note that the motions of your audit may feel slightly different. So I want to take some time here to kind of explain that. But in short, in 2013, if you are ISO certified, you're familiar with the 14 clauses. So A.5 through A.14 that covered, access controls, physical security, HR, cryptography, and you probably had a very clear understanding of who within the organization could speak to those objectives, just because it was clearly laid out based on those high-level topics. Versus now, within the new version, as you can see here, there's 4 themes, which is organizational controls, people controls, physical controls, and technological controls. So it spans from 5.8, or sorry, excuse me, 5.A.5 to 8.8. So things that you may have been discussing in day 3 of your audit, and you may have had very clear understanding of who needs to be included in those calls or discussions, may not necessarily be as clear as we work to figure out, how to organize both internal and external audits, and then ultimately how you will define owners for each of these controls. And a lot of that will become, I think, more clear as you begin to map the older version to the new version, and we'll get into that as we talk about the tools later on. A lot of, just to kind of give some context around the theme and the goal behind ISO adjusting it is, I think it's really just to help organizations use more of a risk-based approach to information security management. I'll talk about what's called attributes later on, but the approach and the themes is really to look at the overall security of an organization, I would say, more in the terms of the various risks it faces, rather than focusing on specific objectives or goals. So hopefully that's helpful in just a high-level breakdown of the changes to 27002. All right, so I just mentioned attribute, and as you can see, the bottom of the slide here, each control within 27002 will now be equipped with this attribute table. There isn't much to note here as far as requirements, but know that there is an Annex A embedded within the new standard that uses attributes, and its ultimate goal is to just help classify and group controls. They will help organizations to provide different lenses for viewing controls so that you're able to determine whether you need them or not. I think this will be especially important if you've got multiple frameworks. Maybe you're working with CIS, maybe you have NIST 853 or 171, to help identify, your entire control framework and what's been implemented and where you've got coverage. So for example, you could use these tagging mechanisms or attributes to think of things like preventative, or do you have adequate controls to detect information security events and not just to prevent incidents. So really, they just serve as helpful tools during your risk assessment and control implementation process. So hopefully those will be helpful, but again, they're not a requirement, but should hopefully be helpful in making other frameworks more ingestible. So the organizational controls, and I'm going to get into the 4 themes or the changes to Annex A 27002. As you can see laid out here, the first big bucket of change or theme that we see is around organizational controls. There are 37 total controls within this theme, and I would say perhaps one of the themes with the most change that you can expect to see. This will really, like I've mentioned here, threat intelligence is a notable net new control. This is perhaps the biggest net new addition, like I said, to the Annex A control list. Many of you may be thinking, I've already got controls in place for threat intelligence, but this control really is more than just understanding, a malicious domain name. Rather than, you'll want to look at building more of an in-depth profile for those threat actors. So this is more of a comprehensive approach to how you're using threat intelligence to inform decisions as part of your risk assessment and information security strategy. More to come on the specific implementation guidance there, but just know that this will be a big one for most organizations as you think about threat intelligence. I believe it breaks it out in 3 separate, they classify threat intelligence as strategic, tactical, and operational. So really the goal will be helping organizations understand how you might be targeted, and then using that information through threat intelligence to inform the organization. The next theme we've got are people controls. There are 8 total controls in this theme. A lot of these will be your preventative controls specific to people. So think pre-employment activities such as your background screening, training, employment agreements, also your during employment activities, so remote work policies, information security event reporting, post-employment activities as well is included within this theme, so offboarding processes. Not much has changed as far as net new controls to discuss within this theme. I would expect, if I were trying to speak with someone who has knowledge on the information within this theme or organize who you need to include on calls during your audit, this will likely be most of your HR legal departments that can speak to most of the requirements within this section here. Again, if you're already certified against 2013, I don't expect this theme to be a huge lift for you. All right, so the next theme covers physical controls. Pretty straightforward. There are only 14 controls within this theme, and it covers all things physical security. So whereas 2013, we had specific objective 11 that covered physical security, this is now just under physical controls theme. So anything related to the prevention of unauthorized physical access to your organization's information or other assets will fall under this theme. So a couple questions to think through here would be similar to what you're familiar with, how you're zoning your space with security in mind. Do you have physically sound perimeters for building or containing information processing facilities? How are you protecting against physical and environmental threats? And then, the standard clear desk, clear screen, all of that is covered within this theme. There's nothing super notable as far as net new controls There are maybe a couple minor, depending on the size of your organization, that calls for monitoring, but I suspect many of you will already have a lot of that implemented. So continue to follow along. We'll provide implementation guidance in the next webinar. But just know there's not too much that you need to worry about if you're already certified here. Some of the resources that I would expect to be able to speak to these controls will probably include your facilities manager, if you've got any sort of enterprise network admin, so that would probably be the people that can speak to these controls here. And then lastly, we've got Team 8, which is covering technological controls. This theme will likely be the meatiest from a technical perspective. There are 7 net new controls within this section, with DLP and web filtering being the most notable. This theme is intended to cover how you're using technology to protect security, really. So, I mean, I've listed things out that you can think through, like cryptography, your key management, policy and posture on cryptography, SDLC controls, secure code. So a lot will fall into this area. There are 7 net new controls here, but the 2 that I'll mention are DLP and web filtering. So many organizations have attempted to implement DLP and then decided to pull back for whatever reason. And it wasn't a requirement in the 2013 version. So if you are choosing to follow Annex A controls and a risk assessment is conducted and warrants this, it will require organizations to focus on tuning their DLP solutions so that they're effective. So that will be a big one that will be interesting to see play out, and will probably take some significant time and investment if you don't already have in place. And then web filtering. This is a notable net new control to think about. This one's pretty straightforward. If you think about, you know, are you able to search Facebook while at work? Like, this is how organizations should filter web traffic in an effort to prevent users from visiting any malicious site. So this control may not necessarily imply just whitelisting or blacklists, but you know, it just says that you need to define appropriate web traffic and enforce it technically. So I think most of the time spent here on this one will be for people and implementing this on endpoints. So again, more to come for implementation guidance there. A lot of folks I would expect to speak to with these controls will be your security admins, your information security engineers, any persons responsible for really ensuring that the integration of your technical controls are working effectively. So this may vary depending on the organization structure and resources, but that should be a good starting point for the roles to think about as you define owners for these implementing these new controls. So I know I've thrown a lot at you, and a lot of this is still very high level, but to summarize what we've discussed so far, we've gotten a view into what is ISO 27001 and 27002. We've talked about the specific changes to the standard by looking at some of the net new controls. We've talked about understanding the reformatting of Annex A into themes versus control objectives. And then we've also discussed some of the new terminologies such as attribute and purpose. And we'll talk about attribute more as we talk about the tools. But you know, that's just kind of a high level overview of what to expect with the changes. Again, 27001, you'll still need to maintain, if you are currently certified, your ISMS. You'll want to make sure that you're having conversations with your information risk counsel, that you're conducting a risk assessment and a gap analysis to understand what some of these new controls mean for your organization, and making decisions on the impact of those changes so that you can prepare for full transition. So continue to follow along. I will dive in, we'll dive more into the implementation guidance, but overall, we've kind of touched on some of the net new controls that you can expect. So now let's transition into the logistics. I think that's where a lot of you likely have questions about when your organization needs to be prepared to comply with these changes. So, big picture, organizations will need to choose when to migrate their control set to the new standard. This timeline here in this slide, this is informed by the key timescale that's outlined within the IAF transition requirements document. I believe Nick handed that out as a handout, and I've also will provide the link. But really, this is just kind of the hard facts based on that document. So if you can take anything away from this slide, let's talk about some of the key aspects that you need to take away. So if you're currently certified, bottom line, you have 3 years to make the transition. You can see in the black box in the slide, you need to be fully transitioned to the new version by October of 2025. Otherwise, you run the risk of expiration to your certification. Accreditation bodies, so those who certify your external auditors. So if you think of, you may be familiar with ANAB or UCAS, they must be ready to accredit certification bodies no more than 6 months post-release. So that's indicated by the orange box there. So if we know that based on the earlier slides, October 25th was the release date, your certification body should be ready to certify you against the new standard as early as April 2023. That's 6 months post-release date. So if you're new to ISO and you're looking to get certified, you could start that process as early as April of this year. Any new certifications, like I mentioned, must be against ISO 27000, the new version, no later than 12 months post-release. So that is indicated here by the red arrow. If you're new to ISO and your external audit is planned for October 2023 or after, it must be against the new standard. So if it were me, I would think about what that means and make a good, strategic decision. Maybe you're a large organization where it's difficult to make significant change. You may want to wait or get certified against the 2013 version. And so to do that, you'll want to make sure that your external audit is scheduled prior to October of 2023 this year. So something just as you're planning to think about, I can't give as many examples, because I know people here may not be certified. You may be coming up on your surveillance audit. So there's various scenarios that we can discuss in the Q&A if you'd like, kind of on when the best time to transition is. Again, as long as if you're currently certified and you're coming up on a surveillance audit, maybe you're coming up on your year 3 recert, you've got time, but just know that you will need to have that external audit scheduled prior to October of this year if you want to maintain that 2013 version. So, and then in the green arrow at the bottom, this just shows existing certification clients will undergo a transition audit. A lot of you, because we haven't seen updates in 2013, probably don't even know what a transition audit is. So just know that your transition audit can be combined with a surveillance audit, or it can be done separately to certify you against a new standard. And you're eligible for that transition audit through year 3. And so you can consider when the best time for your organization is to complete that transition audit. The certification body you're working with should provide you with some documented guidance on their approach as per the IAF mandatory document that was provided. But regardless, that should be helpful for you as you undergo your transition audit. Any organization is eligible to begin their transition audit as early as April of this year, but you don't necessarily have to. So again, if you're depending on where you're at in your certification cycle, it will just depend on when you choose to undergo that transition audit. And then failure to transition will result in certification revocation. If you're not transitioned by October of 2025, your certification will become invalid. So that's hopefully a pretty clear timeline around what to expect in the next 2 to 3 years as you transition. So I'm just going to highlight a little bit more about what is a transition audit. You may be thinking, is that separate from my internal audit? Is that, how do I prepare for that transition audit prior to my external audit, transition audit with the certifying body? So I've just provided a basic definition of what a transition audit is. But because we haven't seen updates since 2013, a lot of this information will need to come from your certification body. I noted previously that your transition audit may be conducted in conjunction with an existing surveillance audit, or it can be a standalone audit. So what that means is you can do a transition audit in place of your surveillance audit, or if you want to transition prior to your next surveillance audit, you can do 2 separate audits. There will likely need to be additional time included, but that's why I included this question mark here, is because the specific duration for the transition will really depend on the actual situation of the organization, the size and complexity of the ISMS. So your certifying body should advise you on your specific transition audit duration and what to expect from the transition audit. Also, I think a little bit about the IAF. You're certifying, if you're not familiar with the IAF, they basically just are a forum that provides requirements for organizations like ANAB and UPass to hold your certification bodies accountable for how they're auditing you. Can't remember, I think it's like they audit you, the certification bodies, against ISO 17032. I can't remember exactly what that is, but more guidance will be provided by your certifying bodies once those audits are complete and they're able to show that they can conform to the new standard and that they're able to audit you against the new standard. So a couple things I think to think about prior to, just before you jump into your transition audit and before you start going crazy to implementing some of the net new controls that we discussed, is to first think about and discover kind of how you plan to update your processes and systems to comply with these changes. So I know a lot of my clients will be preparing by looking at their GRC registers, by looking at their policy sets and mapping all of that over to reflect the control set of the new standard. Also conducting a risk assessment, so reviewing how these controls may impact your organization's objectives, and then aligning the risk treatment plans to determine how you plan to address any threats that maybe these updates represent, and vulnerabilities and timelines to completing the transition. So I think there'll need to be a lot of time spent in updating policies and all of that was mentioned previously. So GRC tool will be your best friend here. Regardless of what tool that you're using, it'll be critical to help you map your controls back to the new standard. So also you'll want to think about your risk register. Your risk register that you have probably maps back to controls within 2013. So having someone, that will be some time and effort taken from the team to have someone go in and help you map those controls. Also, do you have a comprehensive evidence list? Do you understand all of the evidence that you need to provide as part of the new standard? We'll have a lot of information on that we provide over the coming months, but these are conversations and these are kind of the topics and risks that need to be identified as part of your IRC meetings and your risk management meetings so that you can start to put together a plan to transition. Also training, right? So in addition to understanding the mappings and the policies and the risk assessment, thinking about your resources. So do your human resources really understand what it's going to take to implement the net new controls, and have they been trained on timelines? So a lot of this will need to be a collaborative effort within the organization to effectively transition. You'll also want to conduct, prior to a formal transition audit with your certifying body, some sort of gap assessment, and that gap assessment can be done in addition to or with your internal audit. That way you'll have a better understanding of the gaps that are currently present from the 2013 version and what you need to put in place to meet the new standard. So that's a lot of information, but let's talk about kind of next steps and some tools that will be extremely important. As if you walk away from this learning one thing, I would start by just downloading the new 27001 standard. You can't effectively implement the change if you don't have the standard and you're not sure the specific control requests and requirements. So you can download that standard. I've provided you with the link. You can go to iso.org website. I believe it's about $100 and get yourself that standard so you can begin having conversations internally about next steps. And then sign up. So regardless of what, like I mentioned before, regardless of whatever GRC tool you're using or tool you're using, hopefully you're not tracking your program management within Excel. But if you are, you'll want to take a look at all of those documents and begin by mapping the control requests to the new standard. That way it'll help you identify the potential gaps or potential risks. It'll also help with allocating ownership. And all of that can be done within your GRC tool. We've got a great tool here at Risk 360 called Phalanx. If you're interested, I know a lot of our clients use it. You can follow the link there to download and check it out. We're happy to provide more information on that as well. I think having a centralized management system will really help set you up for success to continue to mature your program and remain agile for the future changes as well. So regardless of the tool, you'll need to spend some time aligning your evidence requests, any previously identified risks, and so on to the new version. The IAF requirements document, this is the document that Nick has provided as a handout here today. That is a great tool. If you're confused with anything that I mentioned within the calendar timeline for transition, refer back to that IAF document. It is the document that your certification bodies are required to comply with as well. And it goes into the specifics around transition timelines and when to transition effectively. And then check out our resource center, Risk 360. I know LinkedIn as well. We're constantly providing updates on this topic. We have not seen, again, changes since 2013. So I expect that we'll have a lot more content around this as we continue to help our clients effectively transition. And so follow along there. The link is provided here in the next steps slide. Also, a couple things as far as the resource center. I know that we're currently working on a white paper. We plan to have that in the next couple weeks that cover everything that I discussed here today, in addition to more, including implementation guidance. We'll also have a transition checklist that it's basically just going to be a packet to help our clients effectively transition. It'll include steps to transition. So I expect to have that. We'll have that in a couple weeks and months as we begin to help our clients transition as well. All right, so that's all I've got today for this part one of our three-part series. Are there any questions for me today?
Hey guys, so we do have a couple of questions from the audience today. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to go ahead and submit those to the box and we'll try to do our best to answer it. If for whatever reason we run out of time here, we'll send a follow-up email to those of you who asked the question. So the first question we have is, my organization is coming up on a recertification audit in November. Do we need to complete a transition audit prior to undergoing our recertification?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I know, referring back to the transition document, just remember that by October of 2023, all new certifications must be against the new version. So if it were me, especially if you're running, depending on like the size of your organization, but if you're running a highly complex organization or a large organization where it's difficult to quickly enact change, then I would recommend trying to push that surveillance audit up, to October if possible. That way your recert is prior to October 2023, and you'll have the full 3-year period to make the transition by 2025. So that should buy you some time before you have to make that transition.
Cool. The next question we have is, was the IAF document attached to the invite? So actually, I think I can maybe answer this for you, Leah. So when you use the little pop-up panel that pops up in this webinar, there's there's the little tabs. One of those tabs is called handouts, and if you expand that, you'll see it linked there. We're also going to be sending a follow-up email after this webinar where this and the other resources that Leah mentioned will be included too. So if you can't find it, don't stress. Okay. So next one for you is, how do I prepare my organization for the transition audit before going through the process with my certifying body?
So I think we mentioned this, but first what you'll want to do, you'll need to transition your management system in accordance with the new requirements. So this should include any documentation changes that we mentioned, along with evidence of any new or change process requirements. And then once you transition your management system, you do all the remappings within your tool, you update your policy set, you update your operating procedures, you conduct your risk assessment. Then you can conduct your internal audit to review, to review the new changes, to make sure that everything that you've done within, as far as updating your management system, is in alignment with those changes. And then you can go ahead and schedule the audit with your certification body. But that gap assessment and internal audit will give you a good indication of what gaps you may have against the new standard, and really what can be conducted in conjunction with an earlier 2013 surveillance audit. So if you're coming up on a surveillance audit, I would go ahead and try to get a gap assessment done in addition to your internal audit, so that you can get a good understanding of the gaps against the new version of the standard.
Okay. Next question we have is, what is a surveillance audit?
That's a great question. So if you're new to ISO, ISO is broken out into a 3-year certification period. Year 1 of the certification period is considered your full certification, where you're tested against the full scope of the Annex A controls and clause 4 through 10 of 27001. And then years 2 and 3 are what we call surveillance audit, where you're tested against just a subset of the full control set, really just to make sure that you're still complying with the controls, and that it's just a smaller set or review versus a full recert. So that's a 3-year certification period, and years 2 and 3 are what we would consider your surveillance audit years.
Okay. Next question is, when is the new IA certification exam? When is that going to be available?
The new internal audit certification exam. For like to get certified against that. Actually, I'm not sure. Let me follow up with you on that. And that's a great question. I'll get back to you.
Okay. Next question is, we just completed year 3 of our first certification. We are starting our new year 1 internal audit in February. Is this considered a new certification in terms of the new standard?
Yeah, so again, if this is a recert year for you, you're on year 4, you have that recertification audit planned for February of this year, then you are fine to get certified against the 2013 version. As long as your external audit is scheduled before October of this year, then you can still go through the 2013 version. That would likely be my recommendation. And then that way you've got the full transition period up until 2025 to make that change. So then, maybe next year, the following year, you can complete your transition audit in conjunction with your surveillance audit years. And that will buy you a little bit more time to get your policies and procedures and all of those things updated within your risk management tool or GRC tool.
So this next question, and I hope I capture the essence of it, but it reads, so does it mean entirely the CLP SOPI clauses are fully replaced by the 4 themes, or is it that the previous clauses have been squeezed into the 4 themes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are 11 net new controls. The other controls have been just reformatted, grouped together, or there are just minor, adjustments. So for the most part, just focus on those 11 net new controls, and then just know that the other changes were primarily just formatting adjustments into the 4 themes versus the 14 objectives is what you're previously referring to. Hopefully that answers your question. If not, reach out to me and we can talk more about that.
All right, and then the last question. My organization's coming up on our year 2 surveillance audit December of this year. Do we need to complete a transition audit before November of this year?
No, not necessarily. Because it's not a recert year, your 2013 cert doesn't expire until 2024. So you'd actually have through November of 2024 to complete the transition audit. So you don't necessarily have to complete that before November of this year. I would recommend though that I would consider, talking with your team and beginning to get policies and procedures in place to do that so that you can do the review in conjunction with your recert in 2024. So that way you've already got the gap assessment done and the internal review done. And that way when 2024 rolls around, you can include the surveillance or the transition audit as part of your recertification. But no, in short, you don't have to do that before November of this year because your certification doesn't technically expire until 2024.
Awesome. And actually, we just had one more question come through. So
sure.
It reads, for organization use of the Common Control Framework, CCF, for internal audits that include controls mapped across several frameworks, ISO 27001, would that count as part of ISO 27001's internal audit?
Yeah, so it doesn't really matter what your internal audit is if you want to reference other control frameworks, so long as you can effectively show that you've implemented the controls within 27001.
All right, so that's all of our questions for today. Thank you so much, Leah, for leading this webinar. It was awesome. Thank you, everybody who joined it. Like I said, a follow-up email will be going out tomorrow with a recording and links to some of the resources that Leah mentioned today. If you have any questions or want to learn more about this, feel free to visit our website. If you can fill out a contact us form and somebody over here will be happy to speak with you. Also check out phalanxgrc.com. If you're not on Phalanx already, to try it, we do have a free version of the platform available for everyone. So be sure to check that out. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.